There are stories we tell ourselves to sleep at night, to feel safe in the world we live in. Stories of how evil has a face, how we can spot it before it strikes. But what if I told you that the face of evil could be one you'd never expect? What if the most prolific serial killer in FBI history wasn't the monster hiding in the shadows, but someone who walked among us, unnoticed, for years, right in front of our eyes? Today, we're diving into the life of a man whose name you might never have heard of, but whose crimes will haunt you forever. And as I unravel his story, you'll realize that everything you thought you knew about evil was wrong. Picture this: a quiet, unassuming man, a loner by most accounts. He isn't the type to make headlines, to draw attention. No flashy crimes, no dramatic escapes from the law. Just a man who moved through life in the background, slipping past all of us, leaving behind a trail of bodies that would take the FBI decades to fully uncover. Samuel Little. Ever heard the name? If you haven't, don't be surprised. Little wasn't like the killers we're used to hearing about, the ones who craved attention or left taunting messages for the police. He was different. Calculated. Patient. A predator who knew how to blend in. And the most terrifying part? He knew how to choose his victims, targeting those society forgot. And because of that, no one was looking for him. Born in 1940, Samuel Little didn't have a particularly unusual start. He grew up in a broken home, bounced around from place to place, and started getting into trouble with the law at a young age. Theft, fraud, assault, it all seemed like standard fare for a career criminal. But underneath the petty crimes, something far more sinister was brewing. His first known murder happened in 1970. A woman was strangled, her body dumped in a remote location. But there was no fanfare, no panic in the streets. In fact, no one even knew her name. And so, Little slipped away, unnoticed. He would repeat this pattern for over 30 years, leaving behind a string of bodies that seemed unconnected, random, and, worst of all, forgotten. By the time the FBI caught up with him, Little had confessed to killing 93 people. 93. Let that sink in. But here's where it gets even more chilling. The FBI was able to corroborate 60 of those murders, making him the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history. And yet, no one really knows his name. How is that possible? How could someone commit so many atrocities and fly under the radar for so long? The answer lies in his victims. Samuel Little knew who to target. He preyed on women who lived on the fringes of society, those struggling with addiction, homelessness, or simply trying to survive. These were women who didn't have families to report them missing or whose disappearances were chalked up to a transient lifestyle. And because of that, their deaths often went unnoticed, dismissed, or misclassified. Little was a master of disguise, not in the sense of changing his appearance, but in the way he lived his life. He moved from state to state, avoiding detection, knowing exactly when and how to strike. He would gain his victims' trust, often under the guise of offering help or companionship, before turning violent. And by the time anyone realized what had happened, he was long gone. But it wasn't just his choice of victims that allowed him to evade justice. It was also the way he killed. Little favored strangulation, a method that often left little evidence behind. In many cases, his victims' deaths were ruled as accidents or overdoses, leaving law enforcement none the wiser. For years, the dots were never connected. Local law enforcement in one state didn't know what was happening across state lines. The victims, often nameless, were buried without justice, and Little kept moving forward, confident that no one would ever catch him. And for a while, it seemed like he was right. So, what changed? How did the FBI finally catch up with him after decades of carnage? In 2012, Samuel Little was arrested on unrelated charges. It seemed like just another run-of-the-mill arrest for a career criminal. But this time, something was different. The LAPD, through advanced DNA technology, linked him to 3 unsolved murders from the 1980s. Women who had been strangled and dumped in alleyways. Suddenly, the walls began to close in. Faced with undeniable evidence, Little had 2 choices: remain silent and face life in prison, or confess. And that's exactly what he did. In what can only be described as one of the most chilling confessions in FBI history, Little began to talk. Slowly at first, but then in vivid, horrifying detail, he described the faces of his victims, the way they begged for their lives, and the locations where he left their bodies. He remembered them all. Some of the cases were so old that law enforcement had long since given up on finding the killer. But Little remembered. And he wasn't shy about it. He spoke about his crimes with a level of detail that only someone who had committed them could recall. He even drew sketches of his victims, hoping it would help law enforcement identify them. What makes a man like Samuel Little? Was it nature or nurture? How does someone go from a petty thief to a cold-blooded killer who takes the lives of nearly 100 people without blinking an eye? Psychologists who have studied Little's case point to a deep-seated need for control and power. Little himself admitted that he derived pleasure from watching the life drain out of his victims, describing it as sexual satisfaction. But what's most chilling isn't just what he did, it's how he did it. Little didn't see his victims as people. To him, they were objects, things to be used and discarded. In his mind, he was superior to them, and that sense of superiority is what allowed him to continue killing without remorse, without hesitation. Thanks to Little's confessions, many families finally got answers to questions that had haunted them for years. Mothers, daughters, sisters who had gone missing were finally given names. Their killers had been found. But the sad truth is, for many of his victims, their stories will never be told. Little targeted the most vulnerable, the ones no one was looking for, and many of them may never be identified. As of now, Samuel Little has died in prison, taking the full extent of his crimes with him. But the legacy he leaves behind is a dark one, a reminder that evil can sometimes hide in plain sight. So, what can we learn from this? That the world isn't always what it seems. That sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones we overlook. And that justice, while delayed, can still be served, if we're willing to look for the truth. If you want to dive deeper into cases like this, stories of the forgotten victims and the killers who thought they could get away, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Because the truth is out there, and we're just getting started.